Before the glass towers, before the luxury marinas, and long before Miami became a global financial playground, the city was something far simpler. In the early 20th century, Miami was a regional port town, sun-soaked, modest, and largely disconnected from global capital flows. Its economy relied on tourism, agriculture, and seasonal migration. What few could have predicted was that forces thousands of miles away, buried deep beneath Venezuelan soil, would one day help reshape Miami's destiny. The story begins not in Florida, but in Venezuela. In the 1920s, vast oil reserves were discovered beneath its land, transforming the country almost overnight. Foreign oil companies rushed in, drilling wells and building infrastructure. Venezuela quickly became one of the world's largest oil exporters, and with that came enormous wealth. For decades, oil money flooded into the nation, enriching governments, elites, and institutions. By the mid-20th century, Venezuela was one of Latin America's most prosperous countries. Caracas rivaled major global cities in lifestyle and ambition. The Bolívar was strong, political stability seemed assured, and the country's elite class enjoyed unprecedented purchasing power. Yet even during these boom years, cracks were forming beneath the surface: corruption, inequality, and overdependence on oil revenues. As oil profits grew, so did the risks of keeping wealth concentrated at home. Political shifts, national debates over resource control, and fears of instability led many wealthy Venezuelans to think beyond their borders. They sought safe havens, places where money could be protected from sudden policy changes, currency devaluations, or social unrest. That search brought them north, across the Caribbean, to Miami. Geographically, Miami was ideal. Just a short flight from Caracas, it offered easy access without cultural shock. Spanish was already widely spoken, the climate felt familiar, and the city was deeply connected to U.S. financial systems. More importantly, Miami sat under the protection of American law, banking stability, and property rights, things that wealth values above all else. At first, Venezuelan investment in Miami was cautious and quiet. Wealthy families purchased vacation homes, waterfront properties, and small commercial assets. These were not extravagant purchases, they were insurance policies. A condo in Miami was a backup plan, a place to flee if things ever went wrong at home. But as Venezuela's oil revenues surged through the 1950s and 1960s, caution turned into confidence. Venezuelan banks expanded internationally. Business leaders opened offices abroad. Miami, still developing and hungry for growth, welcomed this influx with open arms. Real estate developers began marketing directly to Latin American investors, promising security, prestige, and profit. This was the moment when Miami began to change. Not suddenly, but structurally. The city's skyline started to evolve as capital flowed in. New apartment buildings, hotels, and office spaces were financed by foreign money, much of it tied, directly or indirectly, to oil wealth. Unlike domestic investors, Venezuelan buyers often paid in cash. Speed mattered more than price. Discretion mattered more than publicity, local banks noticed. Miami's financial sector adapted rapidly, building services tailored to international clients. Spanish-speaking bankers, cross-border accounts, and offshore financial strategies became standard offerings. What was once a regional banking hub quietly began transforming into a bridge between Latin America and the United States. Meanwhile, Miami's cultural fabric began shifting. Venezuelan families brought with them food, music, business customs, and social networks. Private clubs, restaurants, and informal meeting spaces emerged. Deals were no longer just American, they were hemispheric. Miami was becoming bilingual, bicultural, and increasingly international. Still, much of this transformation went unnoticed by the wider public. To tourists, Miami was still beaches and nightlife. To retirees, it was sunshine and serenity. But behind the scenes, capital was laying foundations, financial, architectural, and political, that would define the city's future. The global oil market played a crucial role. Every rise in oil prices meant more money leaving Venezuela and finding its way into safe assets abroad. Miami absorbed this wealth efficiently. Unlike New York or London, it offered proximity and familiarity. Unlike Caribbean tax havens, It offered legitimacy and permanence. By the early 1970s, Venezuelan oil money was no longer a side influence, it was a pillar. Entire developments depended on foreign buyers. Construction timelines were accelerated. Zoning decisions shifted. Miami was growing outward, and faster than ever before, yet beneath the optimism lay a deeper truth: this growth was uneven. Local wages did not rise as fast as property values. Neighborhoods began to change, slowly pricing out long-term residents. The city was prospering, but not everyone was benefiting equally. As the decade progressed, geopolitical tremors began shaking Venezuela. Debates over oil nationalization intensified. Political trust weakened. The very source of Venezuela's wealth became a source of fear. And when uncertainty grows, money moves. Miami was ready. By the end of this first chapter, the foundation had been set. Venezuelan oil wealth had found a home away from home. Miami was no longer just a destination, it was a strategy, and this was only the beginning. By the early 1970s, the relationship between Venezuelan oil wealth and Miami had shifted from experimentation to dependence. What began as cautious investment was becoming something far more deliberate. Venezuelan elites no longer viewed Miami as a backup plan. It was becoming a parallel base, one foot in Latin America, the other firmly planted in the United States. The turning point came with oil nationalization. In 1976, Venezuela formally took control of its oil industry, consolidating it under the state-owned company PDVSA. On paper, the move promised sovereignty and prosperity. In reality, it triggered anxiety among those who had grown wealthy under the old system. Control had shifted from private hands to political ones, and politics, by nature, was unpredictable. Suddenly, wealth inside Venezuela felt exposed, money began to move faster, large sums flowed out quietly through legal channels, foreign accounts, international real estate purchases, and corporate restructuring. Miami absorbed much of this capital. Its banks expanded their international divisions almost overnight, creating specialized services for high-net-worth Latin American clients. Discretion was the product being sold, and Miami delivered. At the same time, oil prices surged due to global crises in the Middle East. Venezuela's revenues exploded, but so did corruption and inefficiency. Billions entered government accounts, yet trust and long-term stability eroded. For many executives, contractors, and politically connected families, the logic was simple: earn in Venezuela, store in Miami. Real estate became the preferred vehicle. Luxury high-rises rose along Brickell Avenue and Biscayne Bay, financed largely by foreign buyers. Developers pre-sold entire buildings before construction began. For Venezuelan investors, these were not homes, they were assets, denominated in dollars, protected by U.S. law. Empty apartments became symbols of security rather than absence. As capital flooded in, Miami's skyline transformed dramatically. The city's growth no longer followed local demand alone, it responded to international fear. Each political tremor in Caracas produced another wave of purchases in Florida. Miami became a financial seismograph for Venezuela's instability. This influx reshaped the city's power structure. Spanish became dominant in finance and real estate. Business culture shifted, relationships mattered more than paperwork, trust more than transparency. Deals were closed in private dining rooms, not public offices. Miami's identity was quietly detaching from the American South and reattaching to Latin America, yet the boom masked deep contradictions. While luxury developments multiplied, affordability vanished. Working-class neighborhoods faced pressure as land values skyrocketed. Longtime residents watched their city become unaffordable, even as it appeared more prosperous than ever. Growth was real, but uneven, tilted toward those who arrived with capital rather than those who built the city from within. Behind the scenes, regulators began to worry. Anonymous shell companies, all-cash purchases, and foreign-owned properties raised alarms. Miami's openness, once its strength, now exposed it to abuse. Not all oil money was clean. Some flowed from kickbacks, inflated contracts, and political favoritism. The line between legal capital flight and illicit finance grew dangerously thin. Still, enforcement lagged behind reality. The city's economy was thriving, and few were eager to slow it down. Construction jobs multiplied. Tax revenues rose. Miami's transformation seemed unstoppable. By the 1980s, Miami was no longer simply receiving Venezuelan money, it was structured around it. Banks, law firms, developers, and even local politics adapted to serve international wealth. The city became a neutral zone, where Latin American fortunes could be protected regardless of who held power back home. Meanwhile, Venezuela's economic foundation began to crack. Oil dependence left little room for diversification. When prices fell, inflation rose. Currency controls tightened. Confidence evaporated. Each new restriction pushed more money out, accelerating the very collapse leaders tried to prevent. Miami felt every shock. Flights between Caracas and Miami were full of families relocating assets, and themselves. Children were enrolled in U.S. schools. Businesses were incorporated in Florida. Miami was no longer a shelter. It was an exit strategy. Culturally, the city evolved at remarkable speed. Venezuelan media outlets, financial advisors, and community networks flourished. Entire microeconomies formed around migration. Miami became a place where one could live in the United States while remaining deeply embedded in Venezuelan life, but the city also became more fragile. Its prosperity depended on instability elsewhere. Political crises abroad fueled construction at home. Miami's success became linked to someone else's failure, a paradox built into its foundations. By the end of the 1990s, the pattern was clear. Venezuelan oil money had permanently altered Miami's trajectory. It had financed growth, reshaped identity, and embedded global capital into local soil. But it had also imported volatility, inequality, independence. When Venezuela entered the 21st century facing deeper political and economic turmoil, Miami was ready once again to receive what fled. The city had learned how to absorb crisis, and turn it into concrete, and in doing so, it had become something entirely new. By the early 2000s, Miami had completed a transformation decades in the making. It was no longer simply a recipient of foreign capital, it was a system built to receive it. Venezuelan oil money had shaped its skyline, its financial institutions, and even its political instincts. But as the city grew richer, it also grew more exposed. What had once been opportunity now carried risk. The election of Hugo Chavez marked a decisive shift. Chavez's rise brought radical changes to Venezuela's political and economic structure. Oil revenues were redirected towards social programs and state control intensified. For supporters, it was a correction of historical inequality. For the business class, it was a warning. Capital reacted faster than policy ever could. Currency controls, expropriations, and hostile rhetoric toward private enterprise triggered a historic exodus of wealth. Money that once trickled north now surged. Miami felt the impact immediately. Real estate transactions spiked. Law firms specializing in asset protection expanded. Private bankers worked around the clock to restructure portfolios before new restrictions could trap funds inside Venezuela. This wave was different from before. IT was no longer just elites diversifying risk, it was an entire professional class fleeing uncertainty. Engineers, doctors, executives, and entrepreneurs followed their money. Miami absorbed not just capital, but talent. Venezuelan-run businesses multiplied, integrating into construction, finance, healthcare, and international trade. Brickell evolved into something resembling a Latin American financial capital. Spanish-dominated elevators, conference rooms, and board meetings. Deals were made quickly, sometimes recklessly, fueled by urgency rather than long-term planning. The assumption was simple: Venezuela would get worse, Miami would get richer, but beneath the surface, warning signs were flashing. Federal investigators began tracing patterns: anonymous LLCs, repeated cash purchases, and properties held vacant for years. Miami real estate had become a global parking lot for wealth, some of it tied to corruption scandals back home. International reports flagged South Florida as a money laundering hotspot. The city's openness was now a liability. Still, the cranes kept moving, developers pushed higher and faster, confident that foreign demand would never disappear. Entire neighborhoods were rezoned. Luxury towers replaced older communities. Miami's identity as a city for residents slowly gave way to its role as a financial instrument. Then came the global financial crisis of 2008. For a moment, everything froze. Credit dried up. Construction stalled. Prices fell. Miami's vulnerability was exposed. But Venezuelan money, still flowing due to collapsing conditions back home, softened the blow. While domestic buyers vanished, foreign capital remained. Once again, instability elsewhere stabilized Miami. This pattern repeated itself throughout the 2010s. As Venezuela descended into hyperinflation, shortages, and political paralysis, Miami surged. Each crisis across the Caribbean produced new buyers in Florida. Miami's prosperity became inversely linked to Venezuela's survival, but the social cost grew heavier. Housing affordability collapsed. Service workers commuted hours to jobs they could no longer live near. Entire districts became hollow, luxury towers owned by absentee investors. The city glittered, but felt empty in places. Growth had outpaced governance. At the same time, Miami's reputation hardened. Internationally, it was known as a safe haven. Domestically, it was scrutinized. Federal regulations tightened. Transparency laws targeted shell companies. Real estate transactions came under greater oversight. The era of effortless anonymity began to fade, yet the foundation was already set. By the late 2010s, Miami was unrecognizable from its past. Venezuelan oil money had helped turn it into a global city, financially sophisticated, culturally hybrid, and permanently international. But it had also tied Miami's fate to global instability. When Venezuela's collapse accelerated, a final wave arrived, not wealthy elites, but ordinary families escaping disaster. They brought less money, but more permanence. They stayed, worked, and rebuilt lives. Miami shifted again, from vault to refuge. Today, the legacy is everywhere, in the glass towers of Brickell. In the banks that specialize in Latin American wealth. In the Spanish spoken as often as English. Miami's rise cannot be separated from Venezuela's oil story. One nation extracted wealth from the ground. Another absorbed it into concrete and steel. Miami did not drill oil, but it learned how to profit from its movement, and the city that stands today, beautiful, unequal, resilient, and exposed, is the final product of that exchange. This is not just the story of oil money, it is the story of how global wealth reshapes cities, quietly, relentlessly, and forever.